Thank you very much, André, for the introduction, for the invitation. Thank you so much to the organizers of this incredible 3 days. It's really been an honor and privilege to be here, and I also wanted to thank all of the staff and workers who have been working so hard to make this a great event. Really appreciate it, and I know it's been a long day, but I'm excited to share some thoughts. I'm also very pleased that we've broken down the grid arrangement of the chairs that we've been sort of dealing with for the last couple days. I think it really resonates with what I have to say. So in the spirit of the kind of experimentation of the collective head that André has invited us to think through, I'm sharing some new work, some new writing. It's a little bit kind of information still, and I really appreciated Patricia's interventions in terms of breaking down the format of the lecture. So I certainly invite questions, comments, interruptions to sort of break down the dyadic structure that we have here. So I'll just begin by sharing some of this work. The title of the program is now the subtitle. The title now is Off-Grid, and the subtitle remains Disability Aesthetics, Schizoanalysis, and the Neural Subject. Okay, so the first modern scientific explorations of whether electricity might be somehow involved in powering the sensory motor capacities of the human body arose in the 18th century and are typically credited to the Italian physicist Luigi Galvani, and we can thank him every time we use the word galvanize. Galvani conducted a series of experiments that involved bringing the bodies of vivisected frogs into contact with different metals. And in the course of these experiments, he discovered that a frog's hind legs could be made to twitch and convulse through the application of rods of varying types of metal. And here he is playing with his frogs. Galvani concluded, wrongly as it turned out, that it was the frog's body itself that was producing electricity that made the frog's legs convulse. This was a mistake that his contemporary, Alessandro Volta, famously later disproved, revealing that what Galvani had ultimately formed was a battery with the frog's muscle as a conduit for creating an electrical charge. So rudimentary as these experiments are, these 18th century electrical experimentations on inert bodily animal matter have come to be recognized as laying the foundations for the emergence of modern neuroscience. Galvani's sparking frogs jolted into existence a trajectory of scientific experimentation investigating the electricity of the nervous system. This trajectory would come to fruition in the 20th century as neuroscience research into the functioning of the neuron and the synapse identified what would come to be called neurotransmission, the molecular signaling of information across synapses, which is now understood to be at the core of neural activity. And here's an illustration of a contemporary neuroscience manual that visualizes current understandings of the electrical synapse. So it's subsequently been established that neurotransmission involves both electrical and chemical forms of synaptic signaling, but I think the sort of figuration of electricity remains. We might think about speaking easily about the kind of neural circuitry, the synaptic firing, this kind of language of electricity that remains with us today. And I think it's also the case that these terms are not merely rhetorical figurations, and it's striking to think about every aspect of our mental and cognitive experience, of our sensory and corporeal embodiment, as emerging from a system that functions by way of and thanks to millions of tiny molecular sparks, constantly firing away, leaping from one synaptic cell to the next, all portended by the rhythmic convulsions of a jittery, electrified frog leg. So almost exactly 100 years after Galvani and Volta's experiments, the Serbian-American engineer Nikola Tesla had another electrical system in mind, this one on a much larger scale. In 1888, Tesla outlined the technical specifications for a system of large motors and transformers that would enable the generation of an alternating electrical current powerful enough to carry voltage along lines of wire, which might potentially traverse large geographic distances. This is one of the commonly told origin stories of the modern power grid. That vast network of generating stations, transformers, and power lines that spread rapidly across the industrialized world over the course of the early 20th century, and which continues to form the basic infrastructure of our power system today. And I think it's also important to note that this power grid, the infrastructure of the power grid, facilitated the development of mass telecommunication systems as first telegraph and then telephone wires and eventually internet cables largely follow the same lines that were first laid out in the power grid. And so here's an example of what the power grid looks like in a map form. So the term grid itself comes to us via the word gridiron, the medieval implement that's used to sear meat evenly over a flame. Yet the grid that we think of today is a distinctively and indeed emblematically modern spatial form, the ultimate realization of organized rationality and efficiency, the imposition, we might think, of human reason over unruly nature. The vast engineering projects of modern industrial urbanization reimagined the city space as a grid, and here's the grid of my hometown of Chicago, constructing streets and cityscapes that could be navigated as precisely as charting the longitudinal and latitudinal coordinates of a map. More recently, of course, the power grid that emerged in the early 20th century seems to have fallen on some harder times, a potent symbol of the infrastructural breakdown and various forms of deregulation and vulnerability to unexpected disruption and risk that we've come to associate with late capitalism more generally. So from twitching dead frogs to sparking neurons to fraying power grids, electricity charts a current leaping between and across expanding and contracting scales, registers, and temporalities. So what's at stake in tracking electricity across these vastly different systems, traversing the neuromolecular and the synaptic, to the infrastructural, the political, and the economic? How might attending to electricity point to unseen affinities, overlooked points of connection, shared structures and patterns that link the smallest, most impersonal pulsations of organic life, and indeed of matter itself, as we were discussing this morning, to these kind of tiny impersonal pulsations, to the phenomenological dimensions of the human life world, and indeed to the macro-political processes of historical and economic transformation. So for the most part, electricity's transversal routes of circulation, its patterns and flows, go largely unnoticed, I would say, until something goes awry. The lights begin to flicker, or they go dark entirely for days or weeks at a time, perhaps because of infrastructural breakdown, or in the case of war zones, we might think of targeted military operations. We notice a disruption of electrical flow too when the brain goes into epileptic seizure, for example. Increasingly as well, mental diagnoses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are described in terms of variations within the speed and amplitude of electrical neurotransmission. So this thematics of breakdown, blackout, seizure, the irregular or misfiring neural signal, I want to foreground these terms purposely, borrowing a bit from the French historian of medicine Georges Canguilhem, who writes in his book The Normal and the Pathological that it is not paradoxical to say that the abnormal, while logically second, is existentially first. It's the deviation from the rule that allows a system to be recognized as a system. So I began to become interested in thinking about these curious electric affinities that I've just been describing while trying to work through a larger set of problems in my my book research that André mentioned concerning the complex relationship of artistic practice and aesthetic theory to how we understand this concept of disability. and specifically to cognitive and mental disability, and even more specifically to an emerging discourse of neurological difference. So in my current research, I've been lately trying to understand and map out a specific sort of set of discourses surrounding these questions, concerning what possible relations might adhere between the three critical concepts that are in my title: disability aesthetics, neural subjectivity, and schizoanalysis. And I'll talk about each of these terms in greater detail over the course of my talk today. I want to do so, however, or at the same time, by tracing one of the trajectories that's allowed me to think about these three discourses in relationship to one another. And it's a trajectory that's emerged by an attempt to investigate where and how the electricity of the power grid meets the electricity of the neural circuit. And these are questions I've come to realize that are bound up in many of the sort of broader, long-standing theoretical preoccupations concerning how we understand the relationship between the psyche and the social, consciousness and history, politics and the body, and indeed of life itself. Yet there are also questions that I think might be perhaps best and most productively approached by turning to the aesthetic and to artistic practice. So that's what I want to do in the talk today. So the kind of work that I'm sharing with you emerges as well from a perhaps improbable source, which is my own longstanding interest in, and even, you might say, obsession with the grids that appear in the work of the artist Agnes Martin. Beginning in the late 1950s, and these grids that have established her place as one of the most critically revered, mythologized, and enigmatic figures of 20th century art. And I also wanted to point out that there is an Agnes Martin painting hanging in the museum right now, and if we could all fit, I wish we could have the talk around the painting, because I think I saw it this morning, and it's a really incredible piece, so I encourage you to go look at it after the talk. Okay, so the fact that Martin was diagnosed with schizophrenia has only recently come to scholarly attention. But the question of how, if at all, this aspect of Martin's life relates to the formal or aesthetic dimensions of her work, I think remains a particularly difficult, unresolved, and fraught question to ask. And I think it's important to maintain that difficulty. Martin, I would like to suggest, is situated at a particularly crucial juncture where the wider historical tendencies of aesthetic modernism collide and come into contact with other concurrent historical transformations, economic, scientific, political, all concerning what we might characterize as the production of subjectivity itself. And the grid, as a spatial figure, an emblem, a structural form, an aesthetic preoccupation that Martin is most associated with, I think offers a very powerful conceptual figure with which to think through these set of questions. Okay, so we're talking about the grid now. So in 1979, writing in the journal October, the art historian and theorist Rosalind Krauss published an essay titled simply Grids. In her essay, Krauss argues that the grid is a structure that has remained emblematic of the modernist ambition within the visual arts since the early 20th century. So Krauss's essay famously traces a genealogy of the grid in modern European and American painting, from early abstract formalists like Mondrian, Malevich, and Reinhardt through pillars of mid-century modernism, such as Jasper Johns, Robert Ryman, and indeed Agnes Martin. So for Krauss, the central importance of the grid to 20th century art is not merely due to the increasing prominence of grids in modern life, right? So she's not arguing that the reason that modernist painters paint grids is because there's just more grids in the world, right? That's not her argument. She actually says that the painting of the grid itself is a modernist gesture in its own right. The grid, Krauss writes, is, and this is a quote, "The grid is what art looks like when it turns its back on nature." So paintings, in these gridded paintings, no longer present viewers with sort of windows into the worlds that we peer into, as one would look through a window. But instead, the grid is a material surface that one looks at. As Krauss writes, The grid does not map the space of a room or a landscape or a group of figures onto the surface of a painting. Indeed, if it maps anything, it maps the surface of the painting itself. Viewing the modernist grid, therefore, compels us to confront the process of looking and seeing. And this confrontation is the grounding aesthetic motivation of the painting. And I think this is actually sort of connected with the sort of modernist trajectory that André was laying out in relationship to dance this morning, but we're sort of thinking about, you know, the kind of turning inward of painting and art. Okay, so born in the Canadian province of Saskatchewan in 1912, Agnes Martin did not begin her artistic career in earnest until she was in her 40s. She came to the grid, the form with which she would be most associated, in the late 1950s. Working with simple rulers and almost always on a square canvas or a sheet of paper, Martin formed grids out of patiently measured hand-drawn lines, often working in graphite or pencil, sometimes in ink. She sometimes gave her paintings and drawings referential titles such as Flower in the Wind, Night Sea, and The Dark River. Here's the Dark River, and you can see a detail there as well. Where am I? Ah, yes. Martin always said that her paintings, yes, so she gave them these like these references to nature, right? But she always insisted they were not representations of nature. They are not representations or abstractions. They are just what they are, essentially. The works are not about a particular referential subject as much as they are concerned with producing in the viewer what she called simply a sense of innocence and happiness. These terms of innocence and happiness recur throughout her writings and interviews. And indeed, Martin insisted that the work itself was only fully realized once the viewer looked at it. So the work itself only came to its kind of full fruition upon viewing it. And it's really kind of a travesty to try to represent these works in this format. So please do go look at the painting. Okay, so many viewers have remarked upon the mesmerizing optical qualities of Martin's grids, which seem to noticeably shift depending on where one stands in relationship to them. Standing up close, you can see the tiny imperfections in Martin's individual lines. You can sort of see that here. Marks that visually register slight bodily quivers and variations in pressure of Martin's own hand. The art critic Kasia Linville noted in an influential review of one of Martin's shows, quote, "At close range, you can feel her hand moving, her touch judgments. She makes touch tangible and visible." Unquote. These imperfections, which haptically register the presence of Martin's body on the surface of the canvas, stand in vibrant, almost palpable tension with the ordered perfection of the grid as an idealized form. So I'm really trying to, and I think the critical literature on Martin really emphasizes how the sort of idealized form of the grid itself is in very powerful tension with the kind of slight bodily imperfections of the line, right? So I think that's an important point. As one backs away from a Martin canvas, and here's another example of one of her paintings, the lines begin to blur, producing remarkable optical effects, such that Martin's works seem at a certain distance back to almost shimmer on the canvas or even vibrate when viewed from a certain distance. So Rosalind Krauss, who was, I think, one of the best writers on Martin's work, writes of the moment when you move backward in relationship to an Agnes Martin canvas, where the painting seems to, quote, go atmospheric. And I think it's a very palpable experience of viewing her work. And it's this quality of Martin's grids in which the surface of the canvas is no longer analogized to a window representing a view into nature, but itself becomes an object that the viewer encounters in a phenomenological field that's allowed her to be placed as a kind of hinge or pivot point between abstract expressionism and minimalism and conceptualism. So she's of the same generation as the abstract expressionists, but she's sort of seen as this kind of link or sort of pivot between those kind of generations of modernist art. Okay, so this is a development, of course, the turn to minimalism and conceptualism that Michael Fried notoriously criticized and denounced in his influential essay, Art and Objecthood, which was first published in 1967. So interestingly, in 1967 was also a pivotal year for Agnes Martin. And indeed, scholars tend to divide her body of work into two major periods, separated by an event that occurred during the summer of that year, 1967. And this is when she was at the height of her critical acclaim and commercial success in the New York art world. The 55-year-old Martin abruptly left New York, where she'd been living for a decade, and moved to the southwestern United States, eventually purchasing a plot of land on a high mesa outside the tiny village of Cuba, New Mexico. And there she is on the mesa. So there, Martin constructed a simple adobe house with no running water or electricity. And legendarily, she stopped painting entirely for 7 years. And indeed, it might be said that in 1967, Martin literally went off the grid. And this is something that a number of headline writers have not failed to notice. So Martin's move to the desert has been a kind of foundational aspect of her mythology. So there's been this kind of tendency to view her as a kind of mystical, almost gnomic desert sage, an isolated genius churning out these austere masterpieces in the wilderness. And it's also significant that she stops making grids in 1960. So she stops painting for 7 years, and when she takes up painting again, it's very different. It's sort of color, it's still lines, but it's not the same gridded structure. So I think that's significant for my argument. So why did Martin leave New York in 1967? Various explanations have been offered. When asked why she left, she often reported that it was because the building where she'd resided and had her studio had been demolished as part of a new urban renewal project of the late 1960s in New York City. Several other acquaintances have suggested that it was due to the end of a love affair. And Martin was famously cagey about her personal life, but it's increasingly clear that Martin had a number of romantic attachments to women, and that's a point that I'll return to. So more recently, another set of circumstances surrounding Martin's departure from New York have come to light. So in her 2015 biography of the artist, Nancy Printhal reveals that shortly before leaving New York, Martin had a psychotic episode. It was not the first, but it was apparently quite severe. Serious enough that she had to be hospitalized, first in New York's notorious Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital, where, again, according to her biographer, she was physically restrained, heavily sedated, and underwent electroconvulsive therapy. And Martin reported to a friend that while at Bellevue, she'd received electroshock treatment more than 100 times. So it was in coming across this striking biographical detail that actually the idea for this paper began to take shape. And I wanted to ask how we might approach Martin's encounter with this sort of late 60s forms of medical authority and psychiatric power, through which the experience of schizophrenia was, and I think indeed is in some ways produced, for a historical subject like Martin. And I'm particularly interested in thinking about her encounter with electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, which is the source of my kind of interest in electricity with which I began. So the use of electroconvulsive therapy in the treatment of mental disorders was first introduced in the 1930s. In the popular imagination, it's come to be associated with the abuses of psychiatric power of the mid-20th century, perhaps most famously represented in the cultural consciousness by works like Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar, and Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and its film adaptation by Milos Forman, starring Jack Nicholson, seen here. Following the kind of popular revulsion prompted by these kinds of cultural representations of the practice, electroconvulsive therapy fell out of favor in the 1970s, especially as more effective psychopharmaceutical drugs for the treatment of the symptoms of schizophrenia and manic depression came onto market. But I think it's also interesting and important to note that ECT has kind of recently come back into use, and many current psychiatrists support the procedure and maintain its effectiveness, as do people who live with depression and schizophrenia as well. So some people, attest to its usefulness, particularly for those whose kind of symptoms are not amenable to other forms of treatment. So this discussion of, and kind of delving into the history of electroshock therapy for the treatment of mental disorders, I think represents a particularly powerful site for considering the questions of how we might think about the relationship between disability, aesthetics, and politics. So I want to momentarily set aside my discussion of Martin, but I'll return to her at the end, just at the moment as she goes off the grid in 1967. And I wanted to say a little bit more about these three terms that I'm trying to work through a little bit, and I would love to hear people's thoughts if they have them, because these are still very much information. I'll say a little bit about each of these terms in turn, and think about how I think we might consider connections between them. So as we've been discussing over the last 3 days, the brain has become an increasingly fraught site of medical, scientific, political, and cultural contestation, a process that scholars including Nicholas Rose, Catherine Malibu, William Connolly have described as contributing to the emergence of a neurobiological age, and then Maurizio Lazzarato and Tiziana Terranova have suggested constitutes a transition from biopolitical to increasingly new political or neuropolitical forms of power and control. Malibu in particular has staged a provocative series of engagements between Western metaphysics and contemporary neuroscience, allowing us to ask about the historical character of the brain and the political repercussions of our models for conceptualizing it. So in the early 20th century, Henri Bergson famously analogized the brain to the central telephone exchange, I think relevant to the discussion of the power grid. Its office, he writes in Matter and Memory, is to allow communication or to delay it and not to transform information into new representations of its own accord. In their essay on the influence of cybernetics on Sylvan Tompkins and his theory of affects, Eve Sedgwick and Adam Frank call attention to how early systems theorists and computer engineers conceived of the brain as a homeostatic machine, an undifferentiated but differentiable ecology that mirrored the automated, allegedly self-regulating mechanisms of Fordist modes of capitalist production. More recently, revolutions in brain imaging technology since the 1990s and has led to the corresponding emergence of the concept of plasticity to describe the constantly changing nature of neural activity in response to the environment. And I think this is maybe a point we might address to think about, is neuroplasticity kind of a symptom of or a response and resistance to neoliberalism? Because I think that's a point of ambiguity that has come up. So Malibu asks, quote, how could we not interrogate the parallelism between the transformation of the spirit of capitalism between the 60s and the 90s and the modification brought about in approximately the same period of our view of cerebral structures? So here I think we might consider Agnes Martin's position in 1967, which is just sort of on the cusp of what would come to be called the neuromolecular revolution, and her position as a historical subject that's subject to these very particular forms of kind of psychiatric power that were manifested on her in very kind of powerful ways. And I here want to actually call attention to the historian of science Roger Cooder's recent call for a historically informed critique of the neuroturn. And I think that this is something that I'm trying to sort of turn to in my own work, because Cooder argues that our kind of neurotimes that we've been exploring are epiphenomenal of our economic and ideological times, and I think it thus remains especially crucial to be vigilant against reductive acceptances of neuroscientific explanatory paradigms that, as Cooder writes, lock us into an ahistorically conceived neurobiological representation of ourselves that can only articulate being human in neurobiological terms. So I think that that's an important point that I want to maybe we could return to in discussion as well. Okay, so how might we actually do this historically attuned critique of the neuroturn? So one method that I've been trying to think through in relationship to this question is that of schizoanalysis. And I'm sort of ambivalent about whether it's about its utility for this particular project, but I'll say a little bit about why I think it has some things to offer. So I apologize if this is people are familiar with this already, but Schizoanalysis is a term that was initially proposed by Felix Guattari and subsequently elaborated in the 2 volumes of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, jointly authored with Gilles Deleuze. So in these works, the term schizoanalysis is used to name a kind of proposition for a new method that might allow for a new way of investigating one particular long-standing conundrum. And that conundrum concerns how we are to understand the relationship between what we might call the psychic dimensions of human subjectivity and individual consciousness, kind of sphere of mental life that we've all come to experience as a private interiority belonging to no one but ourselves. So that is one hand. And on the other hand, the kind of historical development of capitalism as an economic system and the specific social relations and arrangements that it entails in order to sustain and reproduce itself, and particularly the model of the nuclear family, and the Oedipal family, particularly. So as such, schizoanalysis constitutes a critical revision of Freudian psychoanalysis and its dependence on the triangulated Oedipal structure of the bourgeois family. So as indicated by the title, Anti-Oedipus, the classical psychoanalytic understanding of the Freudian discovery of the unconscious and its treatment of neuroses are, according to Deleuze and Guattari, limited and constrained by the bourgeois capitalist terms in which Freud developed his theories. Okay, so when Guattari introduced this term, he developed it out of his work with schizophrenic patients at the experimental clinic Laborde, where alongside the communist psychiatrist Jean Horry, he developed an approach to psychiatric treatment called institutional or group psychiatry. Schizoanalysis is, we might also say, an attempt to introduce Marxist concepts of production into considerations of the problem of desire. So this is the basic point that I want to understand, right? They're allowing us to think about the sort of social production and the individual production of desire as part of the same system, the same process. And so just as Marxism understands the history of capitalism according to the historical development of different modes of production, Deleuze and Guattari ask, might it be that, and this is a quote from them, schizophrenia is the product of the capitalist machine, as manic depression and paranoia are the product of the despotic machine and hysteria the product of the territorial machine. So they're sort of mapping these like symptomologies according to the history of capitalism. And I think it's interesting that many of the schizophrenic figures that they discuss are sort of imagine themselves as hooked up to powerful machines. So we might think about Bruno Bettelheim's famous case study of Joey the Mechanical Boy, and I think very much connected with their assertion that the unconscious belongs to the realm of physics. And I think that's an interesting sort of intervention. So they also, I think, end up at some points kind of heroizing the schizophrenic in ways that we might think about and that I will think about critically in a moment. They write that the schizophrenic, quote, deliberately seeks out the very limit of capitalism. He, interestingly, he is its inherent tendency brought to fulfillment, its surplus product, its proletariat, and its exterminating angel. He scrambles all the codes and is the transmitter of the decoded flows of desire. Unquote. But I think the point that I want to pull out here is that schizoanalysis emerges for them as a practice, not just a kind of theoretical intervention, but actually something that one can do and one can practice. And it's a practice that seeks to refrain from pathologizing the schizophrenic and her symptomatic speech, or her so-called break from reality. And ultimately, and this is a quote from Eugene Holland, who writes the entry on schizoanalysis in the Deleuze dictionary, schizoanalysis represents the hope for the development of productive forces beyond capitalism in ways that will lead to greater freedom rather than enduring servitude. So this is kind of like the thing that this method that they propose for explaining why is it that people are sort of complicit in their own subjugation. And the idea is that schizoanalysis, through these kind of experimental forms that look like, we might think about what they actually look like, but the idea is that we're supposed to produce new modes of freedom. And this is a point that I'll return to. Okay, so this then brings me to so I've talked about neurosubjectivity, schizoanalysis, and now I'm coming to disability aesthetics. So in the decades since the publication of the Capitalism and Schizophrenia, of course, these works have achieved wide-ranging influence on critical thought across a range of disciplines. I think it's important to note that schizophrenia has undergone substantial revisions and transformations in its meaning. It's kind of like this floating signifier, I would say, because it gets attached to various forms of symptomology, and it's constantly under kind of contestation from the kind of clinical perspective, as well as the cultural side. So what is schizophrenia, and what does it mean when they're using it as a term? I think we might ask about. And here's where I want to bring in the field that my work is really engaged with, which is disability studies. I think disability studies allows us to make allows us to sort of slow down and pause and kind of think critically about the use that Deleuze and Guattari make of schizophrenia. And I think from the perspective of disability studies, we might ask whether schizophrenia is functioning as a kind of metaphorical figure or trope, and if so, how it functions as what the disability theorists David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder call a narrative prosthesis. And this is a term that Mitchell and Snyder developed to talk about actually mostly the representations of disabled characters in literary works, which they often have noted function to sort of shore up the kind of narrative or formal efficiency or power of a literary work in ways that actually don't attend to the lived material realities of disability. So this is the concept of narrative prosthesis, and I'm happy to sort of talk more about that if you guys have questions about it. Okay, so the question is, are Deleuze and Guattari invoking the schizophrenic as a way of sort of leveraging its symbolic potency or scoring philosophical or theoretical points that actually distract and take attention away from the kind of lived reality and material conditions of schizophrenia, people who live with that diagnosis? Okay, so this brings me to the third term in my title, disability aesthetics. Like other so-called identity knowledges that have developed within the academy over the last several decades, disability studies orients itself around a set of political and ethical commitments that remain, I think, closely linked to activist and justice projects, of course, in this case of the modern disability rights movement, which began to emerge in the UK and the US, at least in the early 1970s. And we might think about this within the wider context of the kind of new social movements of the late 60s. And in the case of disability studies, these commitments, I think, arguably culminated in the US context with the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1991. This is a very famous kind of protest action that happened, the Capitol crawl, in which wheelchair users got out of their wheelchairs and crawled up the steps of the US Capitol to demand the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I think I want to quickly summarize the tenets of disability studies. I'm not sure how it translates in different contexts. I'm interested to hear about how this discourse is being taken up. So these commitments include foregrounding the voices, perspectives, and lived experiences of disabled people within the production of knowledge about disability. An understanding of disability not as an individual, natural, private, or biological given, but as a category, a political category that's socially produced. Another assumption is that disability constitutes a crucial site of political contestation against the many forms of disenfranchisement, marginalization, exclusion, and violence to which disabled persons are and have been historically subjected. And I think disability studies has also really importantly explored how alternative models and practices of agency, autonomy, expression and communication, care and interdependency might kind of critique and augment what it has come to call this kind of structural hegemony of ableism, this term ableism, whether in spheres of law and public policy, education or healthcare, popular political discourse and activism, or cultural representation. So one of the issues that's kind of emerged within disability studies recently concerns the extent to which its critical frameworks were largely developed in relationship to physical disability, and how these critical tools might be applied to mental, cognitive, or psychiatric forms of disability. And I think this is an important conversation, but framing it in this way, of course, risks kind of reinstating a sort of Cartesian dualism between body and mind. And I think, cognitive and psychiatric disabilities are, of course, also embodied. I think these conversations also allow us to think about kind of the history of social movements and political mobilizations around mental health as a really important contributor to both disability studies and modern kind of disability politics. So here we might think about the things like the Insane Liberation Front that developed in the 1970s, kind of along the model of other liberation movements of that period. And I'm also, in my work, really interested in the contemporary neurodiversity movement, which has emerged since the mid-1990s, largely within the autistic activist and self-advocacy movements, representing the position that autism, as well as increasingly other conditions currently classified as disorders, should instead be understood as integral manifestations of human difference, as opposed to pathologies. And I think it's notable that the sociologist Mickey McGee has written that movements that seek the political enfranchisement of individuals who have historically represented the very antithesis of reason, the mad, the insane, the deficient, the feeble-minded, these sort of historical terms. Mickey McGee writes that these movements, quote, necessarily strains the very notion of the rational choosing subject that is at the heart of the liberal ideal. Predicating personhood on rationality has always been a dubious proposition, and advocating equal rights for the neurologically atypical and the cognitively impaired tests and troubles this formation. So really, this is an image, I should say, of a autistic self-advocacy protest of the U.S. Autism advocacy, or sorry, the autism organization Autism Speaks, which neurodiversity advocates have really powerfully critiqued for its approach to thinking about autism. Okay, so the term disability aesthetics is a term that I draw from the late disability studies scholar Tobin Siebers, whose 2010 book of that title has been really generative for this emerging conversation. So I just wanted to pull out a few quotes that talk about what he's doing in this book. Disability aesthetics seeks to emphasize the presence of different bodies and minds in the tradition of aesthetic representation, that tradition concerned with the appearance of the beautiful. As such, disability aesthetics is not simply about representations of disabled bodies or subjects in works of art, which is, I think, an important project and one that is ongoing and needs to be continued to be worked on. But I think he's also thinking about something more wide-ranging with this term disability aesthetics, where he's thinking about how this term seeks to establish a critical framework that questions the presuppositions underlying definitions of aesthetic production and appreciation. And in so doing, he continues, disability aesthetics challenges the classic notions of disinterestedness in aesthetic appreciation, refuses to beautify the human body, and embraces a different materialism of art. So I think this is a really provocative and powerful framework for thinking about a whole range of issues within aesthetic sort of theory and practice as well. Okay, so I want to think specifically, though, about disability studies, kind of one of its most persistent preoccupations, which has addressed the question of normativity and the production of something called the normal. And it's around this question of the concept of the normal and normativity that I think I want to propose we might cluster the three terms of my title: neural subjectivity, schizoanalysis, and disability aesthetics. And here I want to return to Agnes Martin and the grid. So I'm particularly interested here in thinking about this by a really provocative reading of Martin's work that's offered by the art historian Anne Chave. And she notes that the grid is, in addition to being this kind of modernist emblem, as Rosalind Krauss writes, and Chave writes that the grid is also an emblem of normality, of at once modern and modernist conventionality. So here we might not only think of the gridding of space associated with modern urbanization, the image of I showed, or also the electrical power grid, but also of the spatially ordered spaces of disciplinary institutions, the prison, the factory, the school, the hospital, that emerged in sort of in the 19th century, which Foucault sort of famously describes as being integral to the construction of subjectivity itself during this period of disciplinary power. And I think particularly surrounding the kind of surveillance of dangerous, pathological deviations from the norm or from the grid of conventionality. So understanding the modernist grid as a visual spatial emblem of normativity, I think might suggest some new possibilities for thinking about the relationship between Martin's life and the formal dimensions of her art. So Chave argues in this essay that Agnes Martin's grid of the 1950s and 60s, quote, served in a sense to screen her deeply non-conventional life, end quote. So the grid, Chave writes, perhaps entailed an excess of conformity amounting to non-conformity. Okay, so this is an image of Martin in her studio. So I'm really interested in this reading because I think it suggests attending to the possibility of Martin's mental illness, schizophrenia diagnosis, as well as her, what I want to describe as her queerness, and her experience as a female artist within an overwhelmingly male artistic milieu. So as I mentioned earlier, Martin was known to have had romantic relationships with women, and she also, particularly later in life, exhibited a kind of notably butch style of bodily presentation. A number of acquaintances and friends noted her physical resemblance to Gertrude Stein, and Stein was a figure that Martin really admired, and she actually selected a quotation from a Stein poem for an important 1959 exhibition in New York. But unlike Stein and her famous lifelong devotion to Alice B. Toklas, Martin never had a life companion, and she spent most long periods of her life, especially the latter part of her life, alone. And so it's been really difficult, I think, for scholars, critics, and admirers of her work to come to grips with this aspect of Martin's life and identity. The writer and journalist Jill Johnston, a pioneer of the lesbian feminist movement in the 1970s, who kind of has an incredible essay where she writes about this pilgrimage that she takes to go visit Agnes Martin, who she views as kind of hero. Johnston visits Martin in New Mexico in 1976, and she talks about having a conversation with Agnes Martin in which she expresses a kind of frustration that Martin won't kind of align herself with either feminist or lesbian politics that were emerging amongst a younger generation during the 70s. And when Johnston tried to convince Martin that the reception of her work and her career as an artist would have been easier had she been a woman, Agnes Martin replied simply, "I'm not a woman." So I think I want to think about this a little bit further and suggest that perhaps maybe a schizoanalytic reading might offer a useful rubric for thinking about some of these illegible dimensions of Martin's gender and sexuality. And indeed, if we think about the heterosexual bourgeois couple form as kind of one crucial instantiation of the kind of grid-like structure of capitalist modernity, the sort of the bourgeois family as a kind of cell in the grid, and the kind of social relations that it produces. I want to also think about the grids of rigid gender normativity and its enforcement via the couple form, and how Martin is not, I don't think she's resisting it, but she's sort of on a different trajectory or something in relationship to it. I think it's also notable that in the post-war era, electroshock was also commonly used as an attempt to cure homosexuality. And so we have this kind of interesting conjunction of sort of non-normative sexuality and schizophrenia in the biographical material. And here I cannot help but note, again, that the etymological roots of the grid retain that sense of burning or scorching, which I think is a sort of powerful way of thinking about the electroshock history there. Okay, so in going off the grid, Martin followed her own lines of flight along multiple dimensions. My intent here is not to reduce Martin's artwork to the circumstances of her biography, and certainly not to read her canvases as symptoms of schizophrenia. Nor do I think we can view her work necessarily as a direct representation, even abstracted, of her queer relationship to rigid gender and sexual norms. But I do want to think about how we might occupy a different critical relationship to Martin's work, one that might question, to again cite Tobin Sieber's disability aesthetics, the presuppositions underlying definitions of aesthetic production and appreciation. Okay, so I'm coming toward the end. In 1972, Martin wrote a poetic essay titled "The Untroubled Mind," in which she describes her artistic practice in terms of the kind of meticulous pursuit of a state of innocence and happiness, which she calls the untroubled mind. And the essay hints at the influence of, I think, many sources, but one of which is Zen Buddhism. And in the essay, Martin describes how the state of happiness and innocence can be pursued by detaching oneself from what she calls the worldly complications of personal emotions, which she describes as the chaos and turmoil of the world. And I think it's interesting that Martin kind of refers to herself as a classicist as opposed to a romanticist. And in turn, in this essay, she writes detachment. She talks about this detachment as bearing some relationship to freedom. And here I'll quote a little bit. Being detached and impersonal is related to freedom. That's the answer to inspiration, the untroubled mind. Plato says all that exists are shadows. To a detached person, the complication of the involved life is like chaos. If you don't like the chaos, you're a classicist. If you like it, you're a romanticist. Someone said all human emotion is an idea. Painting is not about ideas or personal emotion. When I was painting in New York, I was not so clear about that. Now I'm very clear that the object is freedom. I'm very clear that the object is freedom. So it's with this notion of freedom that Martin reports coming to understand upon leaving New York that I want to conclude. So what sort of freedom might emerge from being detached and impersonal, from turning one's back on the turmoil of the world, of seeking to eliminate chaos and personal emotion? Classical art for Martin is only as unsubjective as possible, bearing within it, as we saw the traces of the subjective, the quivering imperfections of the line within the imagined, idealized form of the grid. Ultimately, Martin insists, the object is freedom. What is it freedom from? One possible answer can be found in another passage from the same essay, The Untroubled Mind. She writes, She writes, one possible answer is from another passage in the essay in which she refers to the untroubled mind as the state of childhood innocence in which we are open and susceptible to inspiration, a state that is gradually eroded away by the process of education and social development. This is a quote, social development, she writes, is contradictory to aesthetic development. Art's function, she continues, is to re-stimulate inspirations and awaken sensibilities that have been lost to us through this process of social development. So Martin resists, I want to suggest, easily discernible identity coordinates that might be assigned to her. And for this reason, she's not an easy figure to write about. She resists being placed on the grid, right? Many of our existing critical habits for thinking about the relationship between politics, aesthetics, and identity. Yet this insistence on innocence, inspiration, and sensibility against the grain, perhaps away from the grid, I think offers a different way of thinking about the tensions of turmoil and serenity, freedom and constraint that alternate like a kind of electric current in her work. The object is freedom, she writes, and in the next line she says, not political freedom, which is the echo, not freedom from social mores, but freedom from mastery and slavery, freedom from what's dragging you down, freedom from right and wrong. Martin does not give us a liberatory political program or a positive assertion of a disenfranchised identity to latch onto. She remains elusive, impossible to fix in place. But that's, I think, why her work compels us to look closer, to move further back, and to come closer again. And perhaps only through this circuit can we come to glimpse the sort of freedom she had in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. Maybe we have half an hour, so maybe we could start a little bit with a few questions for Leon, and then I'll just ask the others to maybe join the conversation, or if you have questions also for Anne or Patricia or Mette.
Hello, thank you for the lecture, and thank you for all the lectures that we have been going through these 3 days. And now that we have the three curators here, I would like to ask, because I have really enjoyed these 3 days, and I think we realize that all the studies of the brain and so on is really important and really something we have to be kind of discover and like keep focusing on. But I'm kind of sad because I feel it's a very white Western studies, and I'm feeling that there is not a single color person in the whole festival, and we are only watching one side of the coin. So it's like, what's going on? There is there was no one that we could find to see another side of the coin, or is just like, it is only accessible to white people?
Are you asking the curators?
Yeah, just a general question, I guess.
Yeah. It's an absolutely valid question. Thank you for asking. As far as I'm concerned, I think no. The answer is no. It's not only accessible for white people and whiteness. In my list of guests originally, there were a few other guests that were chosen for their particular interpolation between blackness and brain, and one of them was Fred Moten, that has a beautiful essay on that is called The Collective Head as well, in which he takes this possibility of thinking through Lygia Clark and re-articulating the possibility of urban renewal and the urban mind. So he'll be one of the people that I had in mind, but he had a lecture in New York exactly at this time, so he couldn't come. And there are some other people as well. It's an important question, and it's a significant absence that I'm thankful that you brought here. So this is my answer. But I don't know if Warren or Melanie.
Yeah, I mean, it's good that you brought it up because it's an apparent, probably, an apparent lack, and I take it to heart. And I, similarly to André, I can say that I was aware when I programmed the day of this lack, and similarly to André, I tried to be more inclusive, but when organizing such a day, I went through a long list of people again and again and again, and many people were not able to come, especially since it was a day during the week. But these are all practicalities. But you're right. I mean, and you're right in pointing it out, and you're right in bringing it up, and yeah.
Not about if I'm right or not. I'm just like wondering if there are other names I could like research and keep like seeing if there is another side of the coin.
Yeah, for instance, my day was, I didn't have kind of like a direct thematic link to my topic, but I wanted to invite Morgan Quaintance, for instance, who has a different view on the kind of internet culture thematic that I brought to the fore, but he couldn't come. So he would have had a different perspective as well. And then, yeah, and further I can also say that this goes a little bit beyond my expertise as well. Yeah, that's what I can offer to your question.
Again, you're absolutely right. And what I've noticed is that I feel that right now, especially just hearing your talk, which I thought was absolutely brilliant, that there's a whole younger generation that is coming up now and reaping some of the fruits of people like yourself and myself in this field. And as you can see, the orientation of the argument is becoming around much more cultural studies. See, the first barrier that seemed to be between things like, this kind of cognitive turn and cognitive capitalism was to somehow address it to Marxism and to connect it to Marxism through Operisma and post-Operisma types of theoretical frameworks. Then that language, as it diffuses through academia and various forms of the general intelligence, people like yourself who have knowledge well beyond mine in certain ways. For instance, gender studies, queer studies, these are things that when I was going to school, they weren't possible. But yet what happened is what I said yesterday, that the art community, the art theory community has been very reticent to take on the neuroscientific apparatuses that are trans-thinking, meaning that they can be adapted to aesthetic practices as forms of emancipation. And that when we have this idea of neuroplasticity, we also have the possibility, as I said yesterday, of emancipating the brain, that the redistributions of sensibility are very powerful tools. Having said that, now that there's been a deterritorialization of neuroscientific and neuroaesthetics as proposed by Samorzecki and some of those people, and now that we have a critique of that, and that is in the past, now we can have a much more porosity and flow into identity politics, into gender studies, and into queer studies. And I think that what's exciting is that this marvelous conference that you arranged is educating a whole group of young adults who hopefully are of color. And this is not the only place where it's taking place. I just did a conference in the new school called Asset Architecture. That was 2 weeks ago, and we had Noura Khan, a Pakistani graduate of Harvard. She's amazing. She's amazing. Look her work up. Right before that, the psychotropismos event that I did, this was the third part of a theoretical architecture concerning drugs, psychotropic drugs. So the first one took place in Colombia. And in that one, we had, as Florencia will tell you, because she was there, John's not here, we had, lots of people who are of color and people who come from different kinds of cultural conditions, yeah? So this is happening. I think what my answer to your question is, yeah. Like for my conferences, the first thing I'm thinking about is women and people of color. That's the first thing, to see if I can make it, because I want it to communicate to the community as it exists today. The community of students are much different than when I went to school. You've got, a tremendous, range of differences in the student body now that we never had back then. And I want to, and I think if you have people who are on panels and symposiums, they become role models for those people. So I'm always trying to do it. I will say, and one more difference is that the LGBT community, when I do my last school, the Sosfe Summer Institute of Art last year, we had 8.5 days concerning issues of queer and gender. So, I mean, you have to also consider that there's all kinds of representations. Yeah, that was a little long, but I think I tried to create a little bit of
yeah, there's a question there, so I just wanted to.
I have two questions, one concerning the talk that we just heard, and the other one is a more practical question. Would it be possible to maybe publish the list of the guests that were not able to come? So, I don't know, on the Studium Generale website, or so that we would have access and could look it up ourselves.
It's a little bit strange to those. I mean, we can put a list of 100 people that couldn't come, but it's kind of bizarre. And it starts to define also our presence here by the absence of those that are not here, the refugees. Once you start going into the absence of minorities, there's something also that takes place, which is the foreclosure of the possibility of expanding thought that has happened here. So I think it's a little strange to make a list of.
But when you talk about that people were practically not able to come but planned to be invited, it would be.
I think, okay, I'm not going to do it, but I think if others want to do, that's great. I don't think it makes much sense to make a list of. Anyway.
Are we understanding each other? I have to think that maybe
I don't think so. Yeah.
In other words, what I think he's asking is there a list of people of color who are doing this kind of research so that they should be, is that what you're asking?
No. He's asking if you could put a list of the people that we thought of inviting but couldn't come. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I find it a bizarre gesture. I'm sorry, I don't. I would not do it, but if others want to do it, that's great. What was your second question?
My second question is that in the paper for your talk, it was they would name Javier Tellez was also.
Yeah.
And I was curious, how this would, like how you would connect him to your talk.
Yeah, I was writing and I initially wanted to talk about Javier's work, but I decided it was enough to stick with Agnes Martin. But I think, yeah, I'm interested in his, Agnes Martin is a historical figure. Javier Tellez is working in the contemporary moment. So I was interested in thinking about how these questions around, neurological difference, mental illness, kind of critical mad studies frameworks in relationship to aesthetic questions shift historically from the kind of 60s, 70s period to today. And that's an aspect that I'm not sure that I can really speak to right now, but I think the sort of proliferation of diagnostic categorizations and sort of his work with that kind of infrastructures of the kind of mental health system of the 60s and 70s is particularly, I think, like an interesting intervention. So I would probably try to think through that a little bit more. But I appreciate the question. Thank you.
It's just a small thing I wanted to point out, that people of color is not the same as non-Western people. That's it. Because I had a feeling that was being said.
Hello. I had because you mentioned the essay by Rosalind Krauss, Grid. And as I read it, the main point in that essay is that the grid is somehow in itself suffering some sort of schizophrenia, that it's both, it's kind of being between the secular and the traditional. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering how that relates to your lecture. Mm. And also the symbolist, you also mentioned that it was a window, and it also says it's like a symbolist window, or that.
No, that's a big part of that essay. Is it's kind of argument that the grid allows for the sort of reintroduction of a kind of spiritual or transcendent experience in the face of kind of modern forms of secularization. And so I think that I think how would it play into my argument? Well, there is this kind of, I think Martin's work is often discussed in terms of the kind of oscillation between the material and the transcendent. And that's kind of identified as the source of its power, and I think that's kind of what Krauss is getting at a little bit. I guess my hesitation around that in relationship to the disability stuff is that I think it kind of participates in kind of long romantic, also modernist tradition of like kind of thinking about madness as this kind of metaphorical state or space of kind of access to, experience in ways that are more like immediate. And I think that that is also a narrative prosthesis in some ways. So I think I'd want to try to work against that. But at the same time, she is really working through this kind of language of a kind of transcendental, like painting, or like viewing painting as a kind of allowing one to access this kind of state of innocence or childhood innocence, right, as well. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that answers what you're getting at, but I appreciate it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the paper a great deal. Sorry. And applaud the effort that I'm engaged in also. And I'm not sure how successful either of us have been, but because I think it's really going against the grain to try to not think of individual social structure.
Yeah.
That power is over here and something madness is over there. I don't even know. Yeah. And so I don't know that you failed, but I was trying to do it too, and I find it so difficult. But I think what's calling us to it, at least you and me, I think a lot of thinkers might, and surely that's what Guattari was trying to do. But I think what's calling us to it is the network as a different social, and not quite a grid, although it has some echoes of it's carrying some of the feeling of a grid, of nodes that can, you know, so a society can be a node accessed almost the same way as an individual can be a kind of flattening there, but how to engage that with more richness than flat is sort of what you're after as well. So I think it's really quite a difficult and interesting question about politics, about how to, it's the kind of politics we need to be able to think of the social and the individual as something like the same thing, or at the same time, or at the multiple, I don't know. The other thing I think I wanted to say, if I'm not going to forget, is that I also think it's an artistic practice of composition, foreground and back. You know, we might think through it in other ways than just try to really think of individuals and social.
Right.
And a different kind of writing practice, you know,
Right.
presentational practices, that you can do so many things differently than we've been. That's a kind of writing of structure and individual that maybe we need to sort of learn how to break out of and or do other things with.
Yeah.
But it's a great thing to try to be, and you were doing, so I enjoyed that a lot.
Thanks.
So first an aside, when I did my PhD in 2 psychiatric hospitals, I was surprised that they, I think, never stopped with ECT, with electroshock therapy. It was just more or less common in the course of the 20th century. But my question is, you referred to the neurodiversity movement, in particular the autists, and I think they exist for 10 years in the meantime, so it's not a very new project, but it was already said there were different forces in it, because there were some artists or people with that diagnosis who said, well, we're just diverse, we're not, it's not a pathology. But there was also the other group, well, but we would still like to have access to the healthcare services, so we need this label in order to get the treatment. Can you maybe give me an update on what the status of this movement is? Has anything come out of it? Has anything changed of it?
But I mean, yeah, it's a very, very contentious and I don't think there's any single, political vision or agenda. I mean, there's a lot of different groups representing different positions. So I don't think, and there's also been sort of fractures within the autistic self-advocacy community around, questions of access to forms of treatment and, care. And there's also been a kind of split around the sort of question of high functioning versus low functioning, with a lot of neurodiversity advocates kind of trying to do away with that distinction, but then a lot of family members of people diagnosed with low functioning autism saying, no, this is actually a real and material need, that we need this distinction in order to access services. So I think it's a rapidly kind of emerging and developing discourse that I think is actually quite unstable and unsettled, but for that reason really kind of important to pay attention to and think about. So.
Also aphasia, things like aphasia, stereognosia, agnosia, prosopagnosia, these are also disabilities that when you can't recognize someone's face, prosopagnosia, that's a disability. It's, you know what I mean? Also, I wanted to ask you a question about prostheses. In disability studies, in disability studies, where does the role of prosthetics come in, and what is the how is that connected to your particular interest?
I mean, prosthetics in terms of as a kind of critical term, or as a.
Well, I mean, as we move from the body, the prosthetics of the body, a prosthetic hand or foot or something like that. And we get into these things like, for instance, in optogenetics, where they are now implanting phosphorescent molecules into the cell walls of nerve cells, so that by stimulating them, for those who don't know, I know you know, by stimulating this with a particular kind of laser, you can turn off and on a memory. This is already happening. We are going to be having, in the future, cortical implants, brain-computer interfaces. We are going to have a whole nother set of neuroprosthetics, and I'm just wondering, because you seem to be going into that, that's your general direction, maybe, I don't know, but anyway, from your text, you know, maybe, I don't know, could you, what do you think about that? How do you think about those in terms of your generalized idea?
I mean, I think, one of the kind of most useful and kind of influential ideas in disability studies has been Rosemary Garland Thompson's notion of the normate body against which kind of disability is defined, right? This kind of template of the normal human form, and that if you view a prosthesis as the kind of attempt to correct or, you know, augment a quote unquote disabled or debilitated body or mind, for that matter, in relationship to a kind of historically, you know, contingent, determined, normate form, I think, you know, we might critique the notion of the prosthesis as something that's necessary. At the same time, you know, it's still a material necessity and need that people need to navigate their own relationship to kind of like medical, as you were asking, right? Like, it's always about kind of constantly strategically navigating one's relationship to kind of the medical and
absolutely, but like for someone who's locked in, for instance, you know, brain-computer interfaces. Locked in means that you've severed your spinal cord above the cervical spinal cord, and therefore can't move any part of your body, and you're locked into your body. And then there are different levels of locked in, where you can only use your eyes, but you can generate brain waves. These people are now at Brown University. In fact, there's an amazing laboratory there where they are a woman who has been locked in and hasn't communicated to anybody for 20 years has learned to use her brain waves to move a cursor on a computer screen, which allows her to then manipulate a robotic arm that now she can feed herself. Okay? That's an amazing thing. And, you know, that's, in the future, these are going to become mobile, just like computers have become smaller. These devices, the kinds of technology that you need to do that, are going to become smaller, and they are going to be prostheses. And they're going to be a whole new concept of what a prosthesis is and how it operates. I just, you know, anyway.
Yeah, we can talk.
Okay, all right.
Thanks.
There's one question there. Yeah.
Another question to your talk is about, you asked us to ask a question later about the problematics of using, for example, schizophrenia as a metaphor to use for philosophy or to understand political systems or whatever. Could you elaborate a bit more on this?
Yeah, so that's a concept. There's a book called Narrative Prosthesis by David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder, and that's where they kind of elaborate on this concept, which I think is actually quite useful, of thinking about the representation of disability in, you know, literary or cinematic, you know, aesthetic works. And the ways in which disability gets kind of mobilized as a metaphorical trope that kind of adds narrative or formal, like, kind of power to a work, right? But that actually does it in a way that's not about, that sort of supports another aim, another kind of aesthetic aim of the work. It's not actually about calling attention to the kind of material, social disenfranchisement of people who, in the real world, who live with those kinds of conditions. I also, in another part of, there's also a book by Otto Kuijsen, who is kind of thinks about is like a post-colonial literary scholar, literary theorist, and he has this concept called aesthetic nervousness, which I think is also quite useful, where he thinks about how the representation of disability introduces what he calls a kind of disruption in the kind of aesthetic protocols of literary or aesthetic works that does something. He actually uses the metaphor of the circuit. He says disability kind of short circuits the distinction between the aesthetic and the social. So it kind of places a kind of ethical core in the realm of the aesthetic that kind of roots it in a social reality. So I think there's a lot of, I think it's like a really interesting and important place to think about how we navigate the realm, the kind of border between the social and the aesthetic, and how disability kind of figures into that question. So I guess that's how I don't know if that, do you have thoughts about that? Or do you think that, yeah, okay.
It was actually, I have the question, just kind of a follow-up of your question. It seemed to me that at the moment in which you introduced a little bit of a possibility of thinking about neurodiversity, there's a slight hesitation on your part. And I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about that, and maybe even with this question of the post-colonial, I'm thinking about Fanon and like other ways of thinking about psychopathology and different structures of power that are not only medical, pharmaceutical, but like, let's say, colonial, racial colonial, for instance.
Right. Well, so I think one of the questions we might raise about that concept or a term like neurodiversity, and actually there's been a kind of move toward neurodivergence as opposed to neurodiversity, because diversity, as we know, very easily becomes co-opted into structures of liberal governance, neoliberal governance. And I think there's a very real possibility of that happening in relationship to neurodiversity. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of also the really crucial questions about race and racialization, like disability studies is a really important place where these issues of racialization are being worked through. So I mentioned Otto Quayson's work, but also thinking about, thinking about like Jonathan Metzel's work on, it's called The Protest Psychosis, How Schizophrenia Became a Black Disease, which is like looking at how schizophrenia begins in the 30s as a diagnosis mostly assigned to like middle-class white women, and then through the 60s and the emergence of kind of civil rights and protest movements becomes increasingly used to pathologize blackness and black masculinity. So I think that those questions, and yeah, certainly Fanon is a really important figure there. And I'm also thinking of, there's a scholar, Gabriel Mendez, who just wrote a book about the Lafargue Clinic, which Richard Wright founded with a psychiatrist in New York in the 40s that was actually trying to think about racism, mental illness as being produced by racism. And so I think like sociogenic causes of mental illness being directly traceable to racism, which I think is like actually a really important history to unearth right now. So, yeah.
I think we have 2 minutes, because then we need to clean up the space. And so, what's the urgent question or observation? Yeah. Urge or surge. Okay.
Wanted to finish my thought, which I couldn't finish before that. You asked a question that I think is also really important about neoliberalism and where we are with it in terms of some of the things you were talking about that look clearer in the 50s. And as we move, like even to the notion for me of the network, of course that's part of neoliberalism, and the individual being so focused on a neoliberalism makes us want to do something with it and the social. That I think some of the normal and non-normal, I'm not so sure capitalism really cares about normal and non-normal as much as we used to think it did. I'm not sure about governance, it's a little different, but and how quickly getting off the grid can be absorbed by capitalism, so it makes what we have to talk about very timed and lively, which I think you were implying with the, I don't want to say post-neoliberalism, but the tail of neoliberalism that we're we're moving into, you know, so. And I was thinking that in the United States, that just as I was leaving New York, I was reading about Trump's health plan. He wishes to defund all mental health funds to patients in the insurances plans and the health plans. And it's just amazing to me to think where we might go again with mental illness, right? Whatever we mean by it.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Leon. Thank you, Andrew.